All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our classification of life notes video for pages, I believe, 3 to 5. So, in the last video, we finished by talking about the fact that there are 3 domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Those 3 domains of life can then be broken down further into kingdoms. So, there are 6 kingdoms that come from these 3 domains, and we're going to talk about that today. So, first of all, the 3 that you're probably most familiar with are animals, plants, and fungi. Then we have protists, eubacteria, and archaeobacteria. So, looking at this diagram, you can see that eubacteria and archaeobacteria are both unicellular and both prokaryotic. The rest of everything else up here, the rest of the kingdoms, are eukaryotic. And for the most part, they are all multicellular, with the exception of protists that tend to be unicellular. So let's dive into kingdom Animalia. So they have our cells, bird cells, sponge cells, insect cells, worm cells are all eukaryotic. All of our cells have cell membranes. We are multicellular organisms, meaning that we are made of many, many cells, and we are heterotrophs. Kingdom Animalia are heterotrophs. Then we have Kingdom Plantae. So again, eukaryotic cells. Their cells have cellulose in the cell wall. They are multicellular, and they are photoautotrophs. The next kingdom is fungi. So eukaryotic cells. Cells have chitin in the cell wall. They are multicellular with the exception of yeast, that is unicellular, but the mushrooms that you see growing in the ground or the ones you buy at the store are multicellular, and they are heterotrophs. Then we have this weird one, protista. So protists are eukaryotic, so they have a nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles. They are unicellular, though. So that's the big difference between protists and eubacteria and archaeobacteria, is that protists are eukaryotic. They can be autotrophs or heterotrophs depending on their environment. And maybe some of these look familiar to you. Maybe you've heard of amoeba or slime molds before. Those are protists. Next, we have eubacteria, so our first prokaryotic category. It is unicellular, and eubacteria cannot survive in extreme environments. Now we have archaeobacteria, also prokaryotic, also unicellular, but they can live in extreme conditions. In fact, they thrive in extreme conditions. And when I'm saying extreme conditions, I mean things like really high or low temperatures, very acidic or basic pHs, maybe very, very salty environments, or things of that sort, things that most living things don't thrive very well in. So here's a little diagram to help kind of break it down for you. We have our 3 domains here at the top, so bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Then we have our 6 kingdoms right here, so eubacteria, archaeobacteria, protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. This category is for the cell type, so prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And then we have some examples. So maybe you've heard of E. coli. That is a type of eubacteria. Maybe you've heard of amoeba. That's a protist. Things in the animalia category. You probably thought of animals and fishes, but maybe you didn't think of insects and worms and sponges that grow in the ocean. Those are all technically animals. So let's get into taxonomy. Taxonomy is a way for us to name and classify living things. In fact, a branch of biology, which is called taxonomy or taxonomists, people that study the naming and descriptions of organisms, they are responsible for observing and experimenting on species, figuring out if we have a new species or if this species is the same as a species that already exists. So their job is to identify and scientifically describe organisms. So why do we bother? Why do we need taxonomists? Who cares? It's because there are 1.8 million species of living things that we know and we have identified, but there are maybe 50 million or more species that we don't know and that we have not identified yet. So, biologists and taxonomists, we have to classify species in order to make it easier for us to study them and to understand how they are related to each other. The main goal of classification is to assign each species a unique and universally accepted name. We want anybody anywhere in the world that is a scientist that is studying a species to know what that name of that species is so that there are no like miscommunications about what we're talking about across the world. Another goal is to put species into groups so that we can show how they're related. So, how do we identify species? Biologists compare organisms using a bunch of different methods. These include things like taxonomy, so the internal and external structure of an organism. They look at the behavior, how the organism acts in its environment. A big one is the genetics. So we'll look at the DNA of two different species or two different organisms and see if they're related, if they're not related, if they're the same. We'll look at embryology, so the study of the formation, early growth, and development of living things. And we'll look at the metabolism, so what kinds of chemical reactions are going on? How does the organism make and break down materials? So when we talk about naming species, what would you call this thing, this bug over here? Maybe you don't have a name for it. Maybe it doesn't look familiar to you. For me, this guy is a roly-poly-oly. Living things like this have many common names. And generally, each region might have its own name for the same species that we're talking about. Sometimes, even the same name could be used for a bunch of different organisms. So, biologists have to figure out a way to know if we're talking about the exact same organism or not. So, this guy named Linnaeus in the 1700s, he created a system of assigning names to each organism so that we could have a unique and universally accepted name. Now, Linnaeus was a botanist. He actually started his studies on plants. That's what botanists do, they study plants. But Linnaeus created the system called binomial nomenclature. And this is a classification system in which species are assigned a two-part scientific name. So literally, when we break down binomial nomenclature, that means two-name naming system. So again, binomial nomenclature, organisms are assigned a two-part name. That name is written usually in Latin and in italics, with the first word capitalized and the second in lowercase. So here's an example for the monarch butterfly. This is Latin. It's in italics. The first word is capitalized. The first letter in the first word, I guess I should say, is capitalized. And all of the letters in the second word are lowercase. So the binomial's first name, that first part, is what we call the genus. A genus is a group of closely related species. The second part of a binomial nomenclature name is the species. So a species is a group of similar organisms that are able to interbreed and produce viable offspring. So here's another example of a binomial nomenclature for the praying mantis. Carolina is the species, and Stagmontanus is the genus. So perhaps you remember Aristotle. He was one of the first natural philosophers to classify living things, except he put those living things in two groups, plants and animals. He put the animals then into three smaller categories, those that can swim, those that can fly, and those that can run or walk. Linnaeus developed binomial nomenclature and a system of classification to group species together based on similarities, kind of like Aristotle did, except Linnaeus took it a step further. His system organized living things into hierarchical rankings. Each ranking level is called taxon. A taxon is a group into which organisms are classified. So the taxa. Linnaeus identified 4 taxa, but today we have 7. In hierarchical order from largest to smallest, they are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, with species being the most specific, smallest taxa. So let's talk about this. How are the taxa related to each other? A species up here, so this example is talking about Homo sapiens or humans. A species is a group of similar organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. Then we have a genus. So a genus is a group of closely related species. We have family, which is a group of a bunch of genuses that are very similar. We have order, which is a group of related families. Then we have class, which is a group of related orders. Phylum is a group of similar classes. And kingdom is the largest group, which we learned about today. There are 6 kingdoms. And sometimes you might see even domain down here, which we know that there are 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. That concludes our note video for today. So I will see you when I see you.